Today we're going to talk about the beginning of cities and some of the history of urban studies and start to grapple with the idea of what a city is. This class is on metropolitan politics, but what we really want to focus in right now is how cities have developed, and then how we'll talk a little bit later on about how people have moved out. So it's kind of a concept of what are cities and how do we study them. So the whole field of urban studies came along pretty much in about the 1950s and 1960s. And that was really a result of kind of post-war affluence, and then the rise of the civil rights movement, particularly with Brown versus Board of Education decision in 1954 that desegregated public schools, and then other civil rights acts in the 1960s. And what had happened was African Americans then started to migrate towards the north as well and into cities. And what we saw in the late 1960s was in a number of areas we had urban riots, and kind of the white elite started to take a look at these and wanted to understand why these were happening. And under the Johnson administration, something called the Kerner Commission produced a report about those riots in cities and found that really they were the result of poor living conditions and kind of a lack of hope within the city. And for the first time, people started then to take a look at the cities and some of the urban problems that we had related to urban poverty, and start to talk wholesale for the first time in the 1960s about helping cities to be revitalized, particularly after the suburbanization of the 1950s. So out of this serious look at some of the problems that were going on in the 1960s in cities, grew this kind of field that we would call urban studies, which has a lot to do with metropolitan studies as well, because many people who study one study the same. But unlike some other disciplines that you might have, urban studies is kind of a confluence of a bunch of different types of scholars, and no one field really dominates all of this. So in our instance, it's a public administration course, where I would be a political scientist. You have some anthropology professors that teach in the public administration program as well. We have city planners that teach in our program. So it's basically all these people that are interested in the problems of cities and trying to find solutions to them. So drawing on an article by Bowen, Dunn, and Kasdan, What is Urban Studies? They attempted to go back and talk to some of the early scholars of urban studies and try to find out what this was about, and did some research and through textbooks and so forth. And basically they said that the whole idea of urban studies was founded on two basic propositions. One is urban areas are phenomenon worthy of investigation in their own right. In other words, cities and the surrounding areas should be their own discipline. And then second of all, that there was a real need to develop some kind of knowledge about urban areas so that we could help to solve the problems that were faced in urban areas. Again, this kind of all blossoms out of the 1960s, and the federal government for the first time is starting to pour a lot of money into city programs at that point in time to help out. So a lot of this urban studies idea comes from that we'd actually put social science and research behind this in a way that might be able to solve some of the city problems. So that's kind of the outgrowth of urban studies. So you can see below just how interesting and varied and diverse are the types of people that would study this. So we have urban sociologists, we have urban geographers, urban economists studying housing and urban development. We've got a lot of people in the sciences studying environmental studies in relationship to cities. A big topic now, of course, is environmental racism. From our perspective, we're interested predominantly in urban governance and politics and administration. And then also, as part of a public administration program, you'd also be interested in architecture and urban planning and that sort of thing. And that even goes, I don't think that even kind of hits on all the people that are involved in this, because you also have things like historians as well as people in the humanities. There are other humanities that are also interested in studying urban studies. So what you'll see as we go through this semester studying metropolitan politics and urban politics is that you'll get a lot of different types of scholars studying these from different angles, which makes it a very interesting topic to study. Here's a couple years old here, but gives you an idea. This was an analysis of all the articles within the Journal of Urban Affairs, which is probably the top journal in the field, and the breakdowns of the types of things that they would be studying. So you see there's really kind of varied interests in the topics that people in urban studies are focusing in on. So for us, the urban governance, politics, and administration is about a quarter. You have urban planning, you have racial and ethnic and demographic kind of profiles and studies. You have urban geography related to land use, transportation, mobility, migration, economics. That's really kind of what we call the neoliberal paradigm. One of the most important things that studies economic growth at the urban area, and things like housing and community development and change and that sort of thing. So, you're getting, again, this whole picture, I hope that you see, of the varied and diverse aspects of what we study when we start to talk about urban politics. Now, one thing that we can ask ourselves is, what is a city? What is urban life? And you've got a couple of readings, and we'll talk a little bit more about this at another time. But I think this, just as a starting definition from Lewis Wirth, from Urbanism as a Way of Life, gives us an idea of what this is all about. So for sociological purposes, a city may be defined as a relatively large, dense, and permanent settlement of socially heterogeneous individuals. Right? So we've got a lot of people coming together from different backgrounds who are forming a kind of a civilization which makes up the city or urban life. Now, what are some of the facets that are associated with this? So, as you know, we kind of all started out as being hunters and gatherers, where we basically just went around and collected the food that we would need, either finding meat or finding berries or other types of vegetables that we could use. And then gradually we developed a society in which people started to specialize in different things. And once people could not so much worry about what they were going to eat on a daily basis, that specialization allowed people to do things on their own, so that now I wouldn't have to worry about my food. I could start to make shoes, and I could specialize in making shoes, and I could trade my shoe to you for some meat or some vegetables or something like that. So what happens is we start to get civilization when people stop being hunters and gatherers, and they have a little bit of a surplus of food, and then they move into common areas where they can exchange these goods, and that becomes the beginning of our cities. So all of a sudden we have kind of these relatively densely populated areas where people, you have certain classes of people who are no longer responsible for finding their food, they're making things. So craftsmen, merchants, officials, priests, the whole, those sort of things, right? People would have additional things left over because they weren't living in a time of scarcity. They could then oftentimes would give them as a form of tax to kings, or they would give surplus food or sacrifices to gods, and those would then become surpluses for the community. We also started to see people building large buildings that were public kind of monuments, and this typically would start out with religious facilities in most areas being the center of town, and then gradually move on for more secular purposes. Now, having the surplus and being able to have all these people together then created a different type of class of rulers, right? Kind of in a hunter-gatherer society, everybody was pretty much equal because they all faced the same kind of situation of scarcity. But once we were able to have some surplus, then we started to have people who gradually became more regimented and became the ruling class. In earlier societies, that was religious leaders, priests. Then we started to have, military and political leaders also kind of becoming that second part of the ruling class. We start to see the advent of society really in the written record that came out of keeping track of the goods that were traded within certain cities. So writing, as we know it, really was kind of the result of the cities. And then, again, with surplus time on their hands, we saw the rise of artistic cultures within the context of early cities, right? So these were places in which people then could do what they saw fit to do and become specialists in their area rather than just worrying only about eating. Now, if you take a look at the United States, here's the population of all the census since 1790 with the first one. And as you can see, we were primarily an agrarian society or rural society throughout the first half of our history as a country. And somewhere around the 1920 census, we flipped over to becoming a majority urban country. It is somewhat disingenuous to take a look at this map because the way the Census Bureau defines a rural area is any area less than 2,500 people, and an urban area is any area larger than 2,500 people. So there are other ways we could study this, but even if we talk about areas that are 40,000 or above, roughly about 65% of them currently are that. So most people live in urban areas of some sort. As you can see, as of the 2010 census, 80% of Americans live in an area that's 2,500 people or more. Now, here's some interesting things. This comes out of the American Community Surveys, which are done every couple of years. This is the aggregate of all people from 2011 to 2015. And we see some interesting facts about rural and urban people. And we'll tease this out a little bit more as we go through the semester, but you tend to see that people are slightly younger in urban areas. People in rural areas tend to be married. They tend to have lived in the area that they come from more than people do in cities. People in urban areas tend to be more educated, with more people with college education. And the poverty rate is slightly higher in urban areas than it is in rural areas, although rural areas do suffer from some pretty severe poverty as well. The interesting thing as you go down here is that the median household income between the two is fairly comparable. So $54,000 for somebody in an urban area, $52,000 for somebody in a rural area. And that might be somewhat misleading because costs in rural areas seem to be less than they do in urban areas. So while people in urban areas make a little bit more money, in reality, the standard of living costs are probably less in rural areas. So their $52,000 buys more than $54,000 in urban areas. And housing tends to be a bit cheaper, although more people own their houses in rural areas. Now, one thing that your textbook talks about is the idea of systems theory and urban politics. And I'd just like to bring this up so that we have a little bit of an understanding of the various aspects of government that we're going to study as we go through this. So systems theory essentially is the idea that we have people who attempt to influence the political process, and then the political process works itself out through government institutions, whether that be people like members of the city council, whether it be a city manager, whether it be a mayor, the bureaucracy, and they create public policy, which then produces outcomes for people. And it's a rather simple model, but nonetheless very useful for understanding the way things work. Now, if you see here on both sides of this model are the terms environment. So particularly with city governments, they are surrounded by a lot of things that they can't control. And one of that is the components of intergovernmental relations and federal systems. So you have state governments and the federal government placing unfunded mandates on them, telling them what they have to spend their money on, giving them certain requirements. You've got the larger economy, which also oftentimes cannot be controlled by local governments and various other things. So the environment has a huge influence in what we see them being able to do. Now, let's take a quick look here at those inputs. And drawing on a textbook, inputs have two things, demands and supports, right? So demands are basically those things from individuals and groups within society, those people that can vote, those people who could potentially leave the area, and we call that exit. Your threat to leave an urban area means that you'll be losing taxpayer dollars, which is something that local officials do not want to have happen. Now, who we're talking about here, you're talking about prominent citizens organizations, neighborhood organizations, interest groups, business organizations, political parties, and importantly for kind of local politics, the media as well, kind of paying attention to what's going on here. Now, those are the demands, those things that we want as citizens. Now, we give certain amounts of kind of supports to our public officials as well. So, by voting, we're reaffirming our belief in the system. By obeying laws, we're reaffirming our belief in the system. By paying taxes, we're reaffirming our belief within the system. So we're supporting them by engaging in the processes that our government asks us to do. Now, Easton, who's the model that your textbook authors talk about, David Easton says that there are a couple of kind of latent undergirding things related to support. So the physical nature of your city is important to the way that it operates. If we take a look at most cities in the United States, particularly on the eastern seaboard, they're typically in some way built on some sort of water system, whether it's typically around a river or in a port system so that trade could go on. That's important, and the physical nature of that, the ability to be able to expand. Our political culture is very important. Each area has certain demands, certain beliefs in what politics should do, and that greatly affects the ability of people to be able to get things done. We'll talk more about that. The socioeconomic nature of the area is important as well. Part of this has to do with the business base that you might have and the growth and the types of businesses that you have. So, for example, if you're a growing area like Northern California around Silicon Valley, you got a lot of wealthy people there, but you also have a lot of poor people. You have difficult problems with housing stocks. If you happen to be somebody in the Rust Belt who's gone through a deindustrialization process, you've got to deal with a whole different system of socioeconomic problems there. And then finally, as I mentioned earlier, intergovernmental relations is also very important, whether it be between local governments within a metropolitan area, the local government and the county, the local government and the state government, or local government and the federal government. Okay? So one of the things that your textbook authors talk about in England, Palacero, and Morgan is that we can teach people to be really good managers, but that's not enough, right? What we really need to understand is the context in which urban politics kind of occurs, right? So again, you got to go back and check out what are your community values and cultures, what makes your city unique, and then build answers around that. You have to also realize that even though you happen to be a publicly elected official, there's a permanent bureaucracy there who has their own needs, and people like to have the status quo because it makes things easier for them. So how do you make a decision in that context? And you got the political environment that your city, your urban area is in tune with, and that may be, for example, in Pennsylvania, being a Democratic city like Philadelphia or Chester, that's got to deal with a Republican state legislature. How does that affect your ability to be able to get things done? How do you have to compromise? What things, might you really want in an ideal world, but realize that you can't get done given the political environment? And how do you then try to do the best for your citizens? And then finally, individual leadership qualities are important as well. Some mayors have different types of informal powers that allow them to be better mayors than others. While everybody comes into the same kind of formal powers under a city charter or whatever governing document they have, at the end of the day, some mayors are better leaders than others. And then finally, I'm not going to go through each one of these, but it's very important, I think, at the beginning of your first chapter from England, Palacero, and Morgan, that there are a number of different challenges that are facing cities as we enter going into the third decade of the 21st century. And a lot of that has to do with dealing with other governments. And one of the interesting things that we also have is, as discussed in your book, is a migration of a much more diverse America within urban areas as well. and negotiating those differences and trying to solve conflict in that diverse environment is one of the really big things that we're facing. So that's an interesting aspect. I highlight the rest of the chapter to you as you go through there.